From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
During my career at the Library of Congress, I had many adventures, but one of my favorites was being farmed out by the Library of Congress to work with the staff of the Curator's Office on the botany of the Lyndon Johnson China Service. There I met the charming and knowledgeable curator, Betty Monkman. From her days as a registrar of the White House in the late 1960s, she has learned the provenance of every painting, every sculpture, and every piece of furniture. Betty will be signing her book, The White House, Its Historic Furnishings and First Families, from 4:30 to 5:30. Betty introduced me to Bill Allman, the present curator of the White House, who has been so helpful to reference librarians at the Library of Congress. He can always be counted on to provide the odd fact or a quote, and he stops us lots of times from misquoting. Bill has been a White House staffer since 1976 and was appointed curator in 2002. He knows the residence, as some of us call it, or the mansion, from stem to stern, and as well as the people who run it and those who live there. Allman is the author of Official White House China from the 18th to the 21st Century. He'll be signing from 4:30 to 5:30 also. So let's welcome Bill to the podium. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. Book Festival is such a great institution, and I remember being at the White House when it got its inception with the instigation from First Lady Barbara Bush was instrumental in getting it started. And so the White House Historical Association is our very much beloved support agency, support outside authority, nonprofit, and they do a lot of the publishing for the White House. They were started by with the incentive of Mrs. Kennedy in 1961 to publish a guidebook, the White House and Historic Guide, to be sold to the public as they were coming through on tours. And little by little, it's grown into 5 different kinds of guidebooks, and a number of other wonderful historic volumes, 2 of which we'll be signing today. The China book actually didn't start as a White House Historical Association project. It was begun by Margaret Klapthor, who was the wonderful curator at the National Museum of American History that dealt with the First Lady's Hall, the First Lady's gowns, the China exhibition there. Worked in the 1950s with Mrs. Eisenhower to help improve the China room at the White House. And so in 1975, she published the first edition of Official White House China. And so the current book is actually the 3rd edition. It's been brought up to date in 2008, and then it was brought up to date most recently because we've, since 2008, now have 3 new state services of China, all of which were funded by the White House Acquisition Trust, which is a branch of the White House Historical Association. And so earlier this year, they came to us with, you're the source of the information and we're the source of the money for both the China and the book, and we would like to publish a new edition and bring everything up to date. And so it was kind of a hard moment for me because Mrs. Klapthor is sort of a mentor for me and a mentor for Betty. And though we worked with her for many, many years on the first edition and then worked on the second edition, to be listed as the author is sort of a misnomer, but it's apparently stylistically correct for the current author of the most recent additions to a book written by a previously deceased author to get the credit. So anyway, kind of kicking and screaming, I permitted my name to be put on the book as somehow the principal author, but with a very carefully worded underline that says based on previous editions by Margaret Klapthor, Betty Monkman, and Susan Detweiler. So the White House started out as simply a house and an office, It became an attraction. It became a stage. It remained until 1961 for Mrs. Kennedy to sort of say, I think it should have a more formalized museum function, to take it from historic site and attraction into a place that people could come and truly learn about the presidents and the first ladies and their families, about American fine arts, American decorative arts. The earliest collection within the White House would have been the portraits of the presidents and first ladies. That starts with the great standing portrait of George Washington that hangs in the East Room, that was hanging when the house opened in 1800, and then was rather famously saved from the fire of 1814 by First Lady Dolly Madison. But it really remained until the late 1850s for the government to say, oh, George Washington is fine, but what about the other guys? And so they commissioned George Healey, who had painted life portraits of some of the intervening presidents, and they really started the idea that they would collect portraits and you know, so whereas decorative arts were changing as styles changed, the portraits became a collection. Early in the 20th century, there was actually a wonderful big folio volume of reproductions of the official portraits of the presidents. And so ever since, the art owned by the White House has been deemed the official works. But the second major part of the collecting, you know, first for a collection, was the china. That started in 1889 when First Lady Caroline Harrison came to the White House. She was a practical homemaker from Indianapolis. She was a practitioner of the Victorian art of china painting and actually had classes at the White House with a teacher who instructed Mrs. Harrison and cabinet members' daughters and other friends in china painting. She was the first president of the Daughters of the American Revolution, so she was very interested in American history, and at the beginning of the Harrison administration, they celebrated the first 100 years of the presidency. So it was a very historic moment when Mrs. Harrison arrived. She started going down into the depths of the building, saying, what's on the shelves? What can people tell me who are on the staff about what's on the shelves? Is this historic china? Is this, you know, what's interesting about this? And started the idea that this was a way to demonstrate the tastes of the people who had come before. Because what people don't always know is that it was perfectly legal in the 19th century. Congress would say, here's some money to move in, and if that's not enough, have a garage sale and basically dispose of those things that you don't find fashionable any longer. Now, in the China department, many times I think that was a result of breakage. If there wasn't enough of a service to actually continue using it, then perhaps the service would be discarded at auction or simply being given away. So the China collection, she started working on it. There was a very famous journalist named Abby Gunn Baker, who was brought in around the turn of the century to work with Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt, Edith, and in establishing the history of the various services and going to family members and saying, please donate pieces to the White House so we can represent even those people who are not represented. There was not always a formal state china purchase for every administration. That's a common misconception as well, is that there's one every time there's a change of administration. Many times it was a question of how recently had the previous one been acquired, how fashionable did it remain, how little, hopefully, breakage had occurred. And so the China collection was started. Pieces were pulled out of storage and placed on exhibit in the ground floor corridor. They bought 2 wonderful Gustav Stickley Arts and Crafts bookcases to be the China storage space. They had just rebuilt the East Terrace, so now all of the visitors came in through the new East Wing, past these 2 China display cabinets. And so it was made a formal exhibition, unlike anything else that the White House had ever known. But there really wasn't anything written about it other than what Abby Gunn Baker did until Mrs. Clapthorpe and the first big formal book on White House China services. If you want to know about some of them, I mean, we have examples of all of the state services now except the Andrew Jackson in the White House China collection. In many cases, these are pieces that have come back to us because they got away either via the auctions. Occasionally, we've been told presidents would simply give away china. We reacquired 5 dinner plates from the James K. Polk State China with the family provenance of President Lincoln gave them to his barber, 1 plate for every haircut. And the family had these 5 plates, and they sold them sort of back to us one at a time as they needed some more money, I think. And so, but we've found things at auction, and we're very fortunate in having examples of the various chinas. The first truly formal service in the sense of being designed to be presidential was the dinner and dessert service ordered by James Monroe for the rebuilt White House after the fire of 1814. Wonderful shipping vouchers that described furniture and textiles and things that were bought for that refurbishing. We don't have any pieces in our collection of what the dinner service might have looked like, but the dessert service was a wonderful deep red colored border with 5 individual little tiny reserves that were specifically described in the bill as representing arts, science, commerce, maritime, and what they called strength, which was basically cannons and swords and guns in the little reserve. So this china, was used for a while. It got away in the mid-19th century. As far as we can tell, it went to an auction house in Washington where the auctioneers actually took a liking to the china and perhaps didn't sell it at all or bought it, from the government. A great barrel full of it ended up in the hands of Henry Francis DuPont at the Winterthur Museum up in Delaware, where he had, like 80 pieces of this china, mostly plates, and they were just kind of stacked up on a sideboard. They really weren't treating it as any kind of a great acquisition. The White House had 1 plate on exhibit, couldn't persuade Winterthur to lend any to the White House, partly because for a long time they had a prohibition against lending outside the boundaries of their museum. But as a result, in the 1980s, we got a call from a member of the other branch of the family. So these pieces went to DuPont through one side of the family, and here was the owner of the pieces that were in the other side of the family. Only 8, but a wonderful big ice pail or ice cream cooler, baskets, and a few plates. And so he said, I think the White House deserves some of this service because Winterthur's hoarding the rest of it. And so anyhow, we got what we think are the choicer pieces, perhaps, because there's more variety of form in what we have than what Winterthur, in fact, has. The Polk china that I mentioned was purchased in 1845, and all of these were French. There wasn't any American china being bought until 20th century. The Polk china, the Monroe china had a beautiful eagle at the center, an eagle with the American shield emblazoned on its chest. Taken from the Great Seal of the United States, variations on diplomatic emblems. There wasn't a presidential seal codified for a long time. For the Polk china, they simply put an American shield, the little shield with the red stripes and the blue canton up at the top, on the edge of a white dinner service, and then wonderful dessert service with apple green borders, and each plate was painted with a flower. And so we have examples of some of that china. The Pierce china was the next in 1853. It was showed at the Great Crystal Palace exhibit in New York that year. President Pierce attended. He was shown 2 services by a company that wanted to make china for the White House. There was one with a little shield at the center and the letter P on it. And then there was one that had an American eagle on it. Well, he picked the one with the shield, but he very wisely said, it's not for me, it's for the nation, and don't put my initial on it because it belongs to the people, not to me personally. And so all of that china disappeared except one enormous centerpiece. It stands about as tall as this podium and has a basket and 3 graces standing there holding up the basket. Somewhere by the early 20th century, when Abby Gunn Baker was doing her research, this centerpiece became the Dolly Madison china. instead of the Franklin Pierce China. So they moved it like 40 years early and seemed to ignore the fact that, well, Dolly Madison's China, if it was bought by the government, would have been destroyed in the fire of 1814. And so it's very unlikely that it's Dolly Madison's at all, which ultimately it was more properly identified with the good help of Margaret Clapthorpe. The earliest state service for which we could consider dining is the Lincoln. It's called the Royal Purple. It has a deep purple border, an eagle very much like what was on the Monroe China from 1817. And so, I mean, these services were getting bigger in numbers. These early services had lots of serving pieces. So you would have dozens of this kind of plate, maybe 3 or 4 types of plate, but then you'd have fruit baskets and compotes and ice pails and butter dishes and things as part of the China service rather than using silver or glass. And so the Lincoln China had an abundance of these kinds of things, 3-tiered stands, 2-tiered stands with custard cups put all around it for fancy entertaining, enormous punch bowls of which we still have both of them. And so if a First Lady were to say, can we dine off the Lincoln China, there are enough dinner plates and soup plates to actually set a table for maybe 10 or 12 people. Usually what happens then is, and the First Ladies immediately understand the wisdom of it, is that you put it on the table and all the guests come in and you get to say how beautiful the Lincoln China is, and then the butler takes the plate away and brings you food on something that's not so fragile and so old and so rare. But the Lincoln China, when Mrs. Lincoln left, the Andrew Johnsons moved in, there was a huge amount of pilferage as a result of Mrs. Lincoln being in the house for more than a month after her husband's assassination. The Johnsons giving her, sort of quiet time upstairs, and the public simply came in and took what they wanted, and including cutting the tassels off the drapes and taking pieces off the upholsteries and pieces of the china. So the Johnsons actually reordered the Lincoln China, and so we have now china that has a series of differences, sometimes in maker's marks, sometimes in the quality of the application of the eagle. In fact, the Lincoln ones were probably, an outline was drawn and a decal almost was put on, whereas the Andrew Johnson pieces were probably painted by hand. And so there's variations in the china, but there's a good bit of it in the house. The most exotic service ever ordered was for President and Mrs. Rutherford B. Hayes. They hired Theodore Davis, who was an illustrator for Harper's Weekly, and he spent a summer at a cottage on the New Jersey shore where he designed a service of American plants and animals. Now, what the manufacturer didn't know was that, they had priced this out as, you'll give me one design for a dinner plate and one design for a soup plate, and we'll make a service. And Davis comes back with 12 designs for each course. So, and new shapes. Nothing that was going to be a mold that poor Haviland actually had. So they had to retool for the forms, and then they had to make 12 different designs for each course. So for dinner, there was a buffalo, a wild pig, a raccoon, things that might be served for dinner courses. Soup had frogs and okra plants and things that might be served for soup, and the same thing for game plates and fish plates. Ice cream was served on a snowshoe. And so this is a service where we have about 500 pieces. I think it was popular for a while, and then it went quickly out of favor, at least by the late 19th century, for being just a wee bit too Victorian. But it was the only time the government ever permitted the vendor, the manufacturer, to make it for the public, as opposed to it being exclusive for the White House. But it has separate marks. So if you have a piece of the service, it's very beautiful and it's original and absolutely period, but it has a mark on the back that'll say patented, which represents what can be bought by the public. But the patented pieces are in many major museum collections as examples of the style that was being set at White House tables. So The last non-American china was ordered by Theodore Roosevelt in 1903 that was made at Wedgwood in England. And then the Wilsons came in. Theodore Roosevelt had been presented options from China factories in Ohio and West Virginia, offering, we can finally make a good American china, and he still wasn't convinced. And so in 1917, Lenox in Trenton, New Jersey became the first American china manufacturing company to sell a service to the White House. All of the 20th century chinas have been much more formal. A band of color, textured gilt bands around the rim and the shoulder, and then usually a variation of some sort on the presidential seal at the center. And the services have gotten enormously bigger. They went to the dining room prior to 1902 seated maybe 40 people, 50 people max. The 1917 service for the Wilsons was made for 120 because the dining room was now bigger. We now find that the dining room can seat 134. So basically all the chinas up through Truman that were made for 120 start out short if there's been no breakage. And so the more modern services have been made in increasingly large numbers. The Johnson for 216, the Reagan for 220, and then the three most recent services, which was the reason I'm speaking today, is what I wrote about in the new edition of our China book that represents the Clintons and Bush, George W. Bush, and then President Mrs. Obama that have been ordered for 320, so that we can have enough to set dinner in the East Room, dinner in the dining room, and plus some of the parlors. Not outdoors. We don't let the good china go to the tents. So they rent china for the outdoor meals almost all the time. Very occasionally we might let something go out to be ceremonial. So these recent China services, actually when President and Mrs. Clinton arrived, they did something we thought was really very brilliant and said, we don't want to order a new china. We just want to supplement one of the old ones. There's not enough pieces of the Franklin Roosevelt china to set all the tables we need. We like them. We like the blue color, and we like the big blue plates from the Wilson State Service. How about we just go back to Lenox and say, can we make some more? And we thought, wow, that's a brilliant idea. So we ordered more. We had to make some concessions to the fact that they didn't want to retool, and some of the 1917, 1918 forms were no longer the same forms that were being in their production line. And then we were very careful to mark them all differently. So every new piece has the original old mark plus a new Lenox mark with the date 1994 underneath it. And so we thought that was going to be the end of it. Then our good friends at the White House Historical Association decided that for the November 2000 200th anniversary of the first occupancy of the White House by John and Abigail Adams, that they would want to sponsor a big gala historical dinner. And they suggested maybe we needed a big historical gala dinner service. And so suddenly there was a new China on the horizon. Mrs. Clinton took a very great interest in the designing of it. And so, very quickly, originally it was called this, it was to be the anniversary China. Maybe it was going to be the millennial China because it came in 2000. But as we expected, it pretty quickly became called the Clinton China. And so it was unveiled at this dinner where we were still in the midst of the disputed election of that fall, the hanging chads in Florida and all the things that went on, the Supreme Court decision about awarding votes. And so here's a dinner where they've invited all the previous former first ladies and presidents. And so everyone is in attendance except President and Mrs. Reagan because the president was already in really bad health. And so Mrs. Johnson, the Fords, the Carters, the Bushes, whose son was one of the two candidates that hadn't been decided, and the Clintons, whose vice president was the other side of who hadn't been decided. And so it was like, okay, is this going to be a peaceful dinner or not, And what was really wonderful, we got invited, the staff, some of the at least the curator staff got invited, and to be dinner guests, and that nothing but great things were said about the staff. That was really the focus of the dinner. President Ford, President Carter, they kept saying the White House is such a wonderful home. We had such a good time. The staff took such good care of us. You can't believe how wonderful the staff is. So we're sitting there going, okay, this worked out all right. You know, we didn't have any problems, and we actually got, you know, touted for all the hard work people do. And so, but I think that may have kind of set us on a trend to possibly having a new service for every administration. That's a storage nightmare. I have to be absolutely honest. And so it was fairly late in the Bush administration that Mrs. Laura Bush suggested a China service be made. I think it starts to be looked on as sort of a legacy project, something they want to leave behind. This time around, Mrs. Obama looked much more early into the concept of wanting a new service. Partly to be built on the idea that they were getting publicity for modern taste, modern art, abstract art, and could a China service be made that would, you know, be more streamlined and a little bit less historic looking. But as Mrs. Obama very clearly said, I want it to be able to mix and match with all the rest of the services. So some of the things that were talked about at early meetings with our chefs, about, oh, you know, what is trendy now are square plates. And it's like, well, square plates aren't going with the round plates and all the rest of the service. And so, and we had to deal with the issue too. I mean, a chef will tell you, if they had their choice, the plate is white. The food is what needs to show. The color on the plate is a distraction from the food. And it's like, well, I don't think an all-white service is really going to be what gets chosen here. And so then, you know, you start working on the thing, and designs go back and forth, and then suddenly you get a re-election campaign. And so things go to a halt for a while until you see whether you get re-elected, and then you pick up where you left off. And so, so we have another new service. These services have been 12, 14 pieces per place setting, 320 place settings. So you're looking at 4,000 pieces per service. Not so many cups and saucers anymore. The traditional services almost always had a cream soup cup and a bouillon cup and a tea cup and a demi-tasse cup and sometimes a cocktail cup, like Mrs. Reagan. Mrs. Reagan, when she came to the house, she knew exactly what she wanted. And this was the most expeditious service that was ever ordered, because she had it like, you know, we got it early in the second year. I mean, it was all, you know, it was in the works almost the moment she arrived at the house. And it's got 19 pieces per place setting. Cereal bowl, fruit bowl, all the things that if you were here for Roland's talk about desserts, I think she was already imagining having desserts that are only just a couple of bites, but beautifully done, and they needed all these fancy little bowls, some of which I don't think have ever been out of their storage racks, but nonetheless, we have them if we ever need them. And so China has kind of evolved and evolved and evolved, and so the new book that has just come out is a very historically minded book. It's not a all-picture book. It has wonderful illustrations of all these wonderful China services, but there's a lot of technical detail there about, you know, bills and sizes of pieces and prices of pieces and quantities and things. So, you know, it's a read that you can enjoy a lot of it, and maybe some of it's only truly for the collector. Because you have to remember, there are collectors out there. Because of that, you know, 19th century, it was legal for China to leave. And so there are people who have collected and bought. And Robert McNeil was a big collector in Philadelphia, and he left his entire China collection to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and they have now a gallery devoted just to his presidential China collection. So the sort of the parallel book to this is the one that Connie mentioned, what we call the Decorative Arts book, The White House, Its Historic Furnishings and First Families, which was first published in 2000 as an anniversary project at the same time as we were working on the China service for Mrs. Clinton. And it was revised in 2008, or brought up more up to date in 2008. That's the most recent edition. Betty did fantastic text. I mean, it's just the absolute perfect, you know, history of kind of everything that happened over time in the White House in regards to the decorative arts. because, you know, here's this collection of portraits that everybody sees, but people don't know so much about the furniture and the lighting fixtures and the carpets and the silver and glassware and things. And so records are pretty good on a lot of these things. Sometimes records have disappeared, and so you piece it together as best you can. We don't own everything because there were lots of these sales and things got away. So when that book was produced, my job was to do the catalog section at the back and coordinate all the photography of the objects that we had that we wanted to use for illustrations. And so it's a I have to say so myself, it's a really fine book about the subject of decor in the White House and what it tells people about how things changed. The White House wasn't always 100% up to date, but it was probably a good example to the nation of, you know, people could come in and see the rooms and they could admire the choices. Sometimes there wasn't enough money in those allocations and not enough money made by the garage sales to actually keep everything looking neat and trim and pristine. But usually, fairly often, there was a redecoration in the 19th century so that the house was pretty much up to date. So when you arrive at 1901, and here's Theodore Roosevelt, who is very much a student of the colonial revival and the interest in 18th and earlier decor, looking at this house going, wonderful 18th century shell built between 1792 and 1800, very ugly interior based on all this Victorian stuff. And so there was the last of the big public auctions when, you know, tons of things were removed, including an enormous Tiffany stained glass screen that had been installed in the entrance hall. One of Tiffany's first big commissions, 350 square feet of red, white, blue Tiffany glass, was hauled off to the auctions, sold to a man who had a hotel on the Chesapeake Bay, presumably installed in his hotel. And then when the hotel burned down in the early 1920s, the screen, as far as we know, was melted into oblivion. So there's some black and white photographs that exist and some color attempts at interpreting what it might have looked like. But it put the White House, but Theodore Roosevelt then hired McKim, Mead & White, the great architectural firm, and they did to the insides of the White House kind of, let's freeze it. Let's make it look colonial, let's make it look a little bit empire, and stop having it change with every administration. To the point where the American Institute of Architects actually sent a letter saying it should be preserved, untouched forever and ever. You know, kind of presuming that there should be no effort by other first ladies and presidents to leave their mark on the house. And so, but what it means is we don't really have a 20th century collection in the decorative arts. We don't have Art Deco furniture, Art Nouveau things, because they simply were only, you know, living with these faux antiques that Theodore Roosevelt bought, which then Mrs. Kennedy took a big step and said, let's leave the periods, let's just take a lot of the faux antiques out and put the real thing in, so the public would be seeing wonderful things. And then she also said, and we can't just have portraits, we have to have great artwork representing landscapes, seascapes, still lives in the art collection. And so our art collection has grown, our decorative arts collection has grown. We still add to the decorative arts collection. Every new first family buys things for their private quarters. Funds are allocated by the Congress. Many times those funds are now declined in favor of having other sources of funds, you know, so it's not tax dollars being spent on making their quarters comfortable for them. But as a result, we inherit a lot of overstuffed furniture, sofas and chairs, which we've been told by the fire marshal is a big hazard for our storehouse. And so, but they don't become museum collection right away. We've kind of, you know, let them evolve a while, let them be used by multiple presidents before we say, okay, we're going to take every one of these pieces and add it to the permanent collection for museum purposes. So we do not deaccession, and so partly because nobody wants a first lady to wholesale get rid of the taste of the preceding first ladies. And we don't lend to anyone but the Smithsonian and occasionally the National Archives, most often to the presidential libraries because there's a natural affinity. But That was set up early in Mrs. Kennedy's time with the idea that the White House didn't need to have everybody asking to borrow something from the White House and then having to take things off the walls so the public wouldn't be able to see it. And so the Deck Arts book, the China book, and we have a wonderful fine arts book. Those are kind of the three major publications that have come from the White House Historical Association as a result of collaborations with our office. But we also work very closely with them on a quarterly journal and editing and providing materials for that. Symposia that they stage usually comes with some input from our office about materials that are going to be published or subject matters that are going to be addressed in symposia. So it's a great working relationship that we have, and we're very happy to have them as our partners. And we're very happy to have these books available, and if we see you downstairs, we'll be happy to sign them for you. So please, if there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to hear from you. Yes, ma'am.
I understand the concept of each administration buying its set of china. Do they do similar things with glassware and cutlery?
No. We kind of hoped at one point that maybe one of those china services would turn into a new set of glassware instead. What we're finding is, like everyone can probably attest to, the luxury trades in America have gone down the tubes to a large extent. Finding American glass is almost impossible. The glassware that Mrs. Kennedy first ordered in 1961, the glassware that she bought, was just absolutely plain. The previous glassware that had been bought in the 1930s for Franklin Roosevelt was cut. And she said, I really think we should have glassware that if you break it, no one gets mad, because cut glass is expensive and hard to replace. So it was made by a company in West Virginia, then that company was bought out, it was made by another company in West Virginia, then it was made by a company in Ohio, and then it was made by Lennox, and then Lennox closed up its glass factories, and so it's hard. The flatware, we have two principal services of flatware. Gilded silver, which is actually an amalgamation of historic silvers. So there are forks from the 1890s, knives from the 1920s, spoons from the 1950s, all kind of based on silver from the Andrew Jackson era that are often used for state dinners. And then there's a silver service that was provided in the Ford administration that we bought from Gorham. It was a pattern that was called King Charles. It's actually the King George pattern, or the traditional King's pattern, but they had renamed it King Charles because they were selling it at historic Charleston. So it's used. It does not have White House written on it. All the other earlier silvers, including the gilded silver, is engraved President's House, which is the traditional words on the silver services, the old, early 19th century name for it rather than the White House. So they seem to serve our purposes well. There could be a time when a First Lady would say, gee, I wish we had something that looked more modern than these very 18th century flatware services. And the same could be said for the glass. I know the head of our food service people didn't like Mrs. Kennedy's glass. By the time we were to the 21st century, he said, these are glasses that are too small for modern drinking, and champagne should be a flute and not a tulip, and so he would be all for a new glass service. Oh, yes.
I was wondering if you could talk about the role of symbolism in helping the first family either choose a service from a different administration for a dinner party or more permanent furniture, such as President Obama's choice to use the Resolute desk in his Oval Office.
Well, the Resolute desk is a wonderful piece of furniture that was commissioned by Queen Victoria to give to President Rutherford Hayes in 1880. It's a great big partners kind of desk. Franklin Roosevelt commissioned a presidential seal to insert so that if he were sitting on the other side, you couldn't see his leg braces. It was used in the private quarters until President Kennedy put it in the Oval Office, and that made it was a big symbolic statement of bringing out a historic object in Mrs. Kennedy's work to be more museum-like. It then traveled as a result of President Kennedy's assassination. It was like part of his package, and so it didn't come back to the White House until President Carter asked for it back in 1977. And so it's been used by every president in the Oval Office except for George H.W. Bush, who preferred to use his vice presidential desk since he had a desk in the West Wing for continuity, but he used it in the private residence. Other things that are symbolic, obviously in this new China, the presidential seal has made an appearance on 3 of the pieces out of the 11 that are part of the Obama China. The traditional places to put it is on the service plate, the first thing you see at the table, and the dessert plate, the last thing you see at the table. The service plate, it's in the center where no food's actually served on it. And then in this case, it's also on the side of the little cup and saucer that's part of the last course. Other services had more eagles. Mrs. Johnson, actually, in designing the china that Connie mentioned, working on for the flowers, for the dessert plates, she took the eagle off the 1817 Monroe china. And she really went back to a historical precedent and put a very early American version of the eagle, and then put wildflowers around the borders of some of the plates to represent her interest in the roadside and the preservation of the land. And then the 51 different dessert plates had the state flower for each of the 50 states and the District of Columbia. And so sometimes symbolism is built into the china. I know with the Obama china, there's a certain amount of streamlining in the design, and that was designed to represent their interest in the abstract and the more modern. Mrs. Bush, Laura Bush, picked a very non-traditional eagle for her state china. It was an inlay in the sideboard in the family dining room that had a sideboard that had belonged to Daniel Webster, and she just thought it was very much more naive than a traditional, defined by a heraldry person kind of eagle. But that's what she wanted, and so that's what went on her china. So, really our office is not the arbiter of the design. We suggest, we help with colors and looking at the other earlier services. More often than not, ours is a question of quantities, shapes, storability, and things that go into a china service beyond the actual, what makes it beautiful.
What is served in the cocktail cup? The only thing I could possibly think of was a Tom and Jerry, but usually...
No, what they call a cocktail cup is a little tiny ramekin. You got a ramekin, you put the shrimp in the ramekin or whatever, and then you put the cocktail sauce in the...
Oh! I, of course, was thinking of whiskey.
That's not a beverage cup. But sometimes they're used for little tiny desserts, creme brulee or whatever can be put in the ramekins and things. So, yes, sir.
Do you have any record of china that was used in the personal quarters? I've got some pieces of a Haviland china that came down through my family, and the person that they were acquired from said that it was used by Theodore Roosevelt. It's not the official pattern, and it's not the manufacturer that you referenced that Theodore Roosevelt used. What's a research approach that you could use or is there one?
Well, usually it's finding who's got any comparable, like the Sagamore Hill, the Theodore Roosevelt home, have most of that same china that might have been used in the private quarters by the family. A lot of some of the presidents brought china for that purpose. Some of them bought china while they were in office. In other cases, some of these, like the Woodrow Wilson and the Franklin Roosevelt chinas, this is a state dinner china service that comes with oatmeal bowls because it would be used for serving breakfast just as well as serving dinner. There's a much published story about President Warren Harding, who had many illegal, I guess the poker parties weren't illegal, but the drinking of booze at the poker parties was illegal under the Volstead Act. But supposedly he gambled away a barrel of White House china. But we can't find where there's a loss in the inventory to represent that kind of thing. So maybe it was a family china that he was willing to give up because he could buy some more, possibly. But if you can send us some pictures. I don't think we'll be the best source, but I would say if it really is Theodore Roosevelt, the best place to start is Sagamore Hill and see if by any chance they own some of the same china. I mean, we have some personal pieces in our collection that came as a result of first ladies in the early 20th century asking families to give something to represent a president who would not otherwise be represented. So we do have some pieces associated with Andrew Johnson and Garfield, but and in some cases we know that they have more of it wherever their institutional home is. Yes?
A little bit back on the symbolism. I understand that the Obama china is based a bit on a earlier china. I believe the Monroe, is that correct?
Madison.
Madison.
Close.
Thank you. And I've seen them both, but could you go into that a little bit?
Sure. The dinner plate, well, let's see, there's 11 pieces. The service plate has a wide gold border, which has been true of the Clinton china and some plates that the Eisenhowers ordered that seem to be very presidential, but with a very narrow, ridged or striated kind of border to look much more modern and clean than lots of frilly Rococo kind of stuff that's been in some of the other chinas. Then the dinner plate was based on a family service that belonged to the Madisons. I think it's a very modern china for 1806. It's kind of pinwheels and fronds done in black and white on orange background. I mean, it was a service that was bought while he was Secretary of State and may have been used at the post-fire presidential homes in Washington that Madison lived in because he didn't get back into the White House before leaving office. So we have several pieces of that in the China room, and it drew the attention of Mrs. Obama, as I think this is a wonderful decorative element. And so it was just done on white on white. So it's just a raised element rather than a painted element. And then the rest of the service has the blue with the ridges, the striated kind of border that was derived from a color which is supposedly the color of the water off the president's home in Kailua in Hawaii. And so that was a throw into the symbolism of connecting the old and the traditional with a color that was unprecedented, with kind of the streamlined designing, which was somewhat unprecedented. And the other interesting element is that, there are only kind of two American china makers right now. Lenox, which closed up all of its New Jersey factories and moved to North Carolina as an economy after they went bankrupt once. And then Picard out in Antioch, Illinois. And so Mrs. Obama said, well, how about Lenox has made almost all the 20th century chinas for the White House. Let's pick Picard because they're from our home state. And so it got a chance to sort of, make a statement there about going a little further afield and getting something from home. Yes, ma'am.
Does your office collaborate with the White House Historical Association on the Christmas tree ornaments?
Not very much. They've got a great historian, Bill Seal, who has written the definitive 2-volume book, The President's House, who I think is the principal source of information for the ornament. Certainly, if they have any kind of questions or want any confirmations, it's a very easy two-way street coming back and forth. And so the ornaments, I don't know if you don't know the ornaments, they've been going in chronological order with a few exceptions where they threw in one for like the 200th anniversary of the House or the 200th anniversary of the presidency. And so this year's is going to be Herbert Hoover. And so it's already been revealed, so I'm not telling any secrets. It's not like it's fall and therefore the Christmas ornament comes out, but it's a fire engine. because on Christmas Eve, 1929, while the Hoovers were having Christmas dinner in the state dining room, staff person walks in and says, "Mr. President, the West Wing's on fire." And so they went out on the terrace and watched the firemen come and put out the fire. Staff people went over to the house. His son went over to try to save the papers out of his desk drawers in the office. One of the staff people had bought a puppy for his son and put it in his office, and so he went to rescue the dog and successfully rescued the dog. But some of the members of the dinner party were young children, and so in 1930 for Christmas, Mrs. Hoover commissioned toy fire engines to give to all the children who had witnessed the West Wing fire. So it's a nice, everybody, it's a toy. It looks great as a Christmas ornament, with a Christmas tree in the back of the fire truck and everything. So I think it's going to be a big seller. I'm sure they're hoping so too. The nice thing we get, as was mentioned, the White House Historical Association funds a lot of our work, acquisitions, new drapes, new carpets for public rooms, new China services and things. So we probably couldn't do a lot of what we do without their regular support. So, and the ornaments help fill up the coffers. They sell a lot. Yes, ma'am.
Is it okay if I ask a second question?
Only up to the time limit. I have no wrap up.
Okay. On the back of most china, you see the name of the manufacturer, such as Lenox, and then maybe the name that the china manufacturer has given it. What is on the back of White House china?
Pretty much the same. It'll have the commercial logo for the manufacturer. Let's say for Lenox, which is traditional. It's an L with a wreath around it, and then it'll say Lenox, made in America, or made in the USA. It's kind of their tradition. Then it says the White House and the date. So that's for the usable china. We also make place settings for the china room, which says White House China Collection separately, for the President's Library that will say the Barack Obama Presidential Library and Museum, a place setting for the President First Lady, and a place setting for the Smithsonian to continue the long-standing tradition where Margaret Clapthorne worked so hard on creating a China collection in the Museum of American History. And so those are the separate marks that go on what we call the archival place settings. Thank you. Okay, I think I have to wrap up, so thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.